I never imagined that the biggest threat to everything I built wouldn't come from a competitor, a recession, or a failed investment. It came from my own mother. 3 years after my father died, she walked onto the estate I had rebuilt from nothing, threw a legal folder onto a stone table, and gave me exactly 48 hours to surrender my company to my older brother. She said he was finally ready to become the head of the family, and that I had already played businesswoman long enough. She thought I would break the way I always had when I was younger. She thought I would hand everything over just to keep the peace. What neither she nor my brother understood was that I had spent the last 3 years preparing for the day they would come to take everything from me. And when my brother arrived a few minutes later carrying a crowbar because he believed he was about to claim an abandoned estate, his face changed forever the moment he realized he wasn't looking at a forgotten property anymore. He was looking at an empire. Please, before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 34 years old now, and enough time has passed that I can finally tell this story without anger controlling every word. Looking back, I realized the warning signs had always been there. My mother never truly believed I could build anything valuable. She simply tolerated my ambitions because she assumed I would eventually fail. My brother Brandon never believed he needed to work for success because our family spent his entire life convincing him that success belonged to him by birthright. I was the opposite. Every achievement I ever earned came with another reason someone thought it wasn't enough. When my father passed away, everything changed, but not in the way most people would expect. I'll explain what happened after his death later because that's where the roots of this story really begin. Right now, I want you to understand exactly what I had built before my family tried to take it away. Willowmere Estate sat quietly in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by towering pines, rolling hills, and acres of restored gardens. 3 years earlier, it had been nothing more than a neglected property everyone else considered worthless. The roof leaked. The barns leaned dangerously to one side. Most people believed it should be demolished. I saw something completely different. I saw possibility. I borrowed money that terrified me. I signed loan documents that kept me awake for months. I lived inside a small construction trailer, while contractors rebuilt walls, electricians rewired entire buildings, landscapers transformed abandoned fields into elegant gardens, and I spent nearly every waking hour solving one problem after another. There were nights I honestly believed I had ruined my own life chasing an impossible dream. There were mornings I questioned whether I should simply sell everything before the debt buried me. But each obstacle forced me to become stronger, smarter, and more determined than I had ever imagined. Eventually, the broken estate disappeared. In its place stood one of the most exclusive executive retreat destinations in the region. Corporate leaders booked conferences months in advance. Luxury weddings filled the calendar. Investors who once ignored me now requested meetings. That Saturday morning should have been one of the proudest days of my life. My staff moved confidently across the courtyard, preparing for a major technology company's executive retreat. Fresh flowers lined the walkways. Crystal glassware sparkled beneath the morning sunlight. Chefs prepared breakfast while my event coordinators confirmed arrival schedules with chauffeurs and private drivers. Every detail had been planned weeks in advance because that's how I ran my business. Nothing was left to chance. I remember standing near the entrance watching everything come together and thinking that maybe, for the first time in my life, I had finally built something nobody could take away from me. I couldn't have been more wrong. The heavy wrought iron entrance gates suddenly opened. At first, I assumed another delivery truck had arrived early. Instead, I saw my mother walking directly toward me wearing an expensive cream-colored coat, as though she owned the property herself. She ignored every employee who greeted her. She ignored the receptionist. She ignored security. She walked with complete confidence because she had spent decades believing every room belonged to her the moment she entered it. Even after everything I had accomplished, I could still feel my body reacting the way it had when I was a little girl. My shoulders stiffened. My heartbeat quickened. Some childhood fears never disappear completely. They simply wait for familiar footsteps. She stopped only a few feet away from me without smiling, without asking how I was, without acknowledging the business surrounding us. She removed a thick legal folder from her designer handbag and dropped it onto the table between us. The sharp sound echoed across the courtyard loudly enough that several members of my staff looked over. "You have 48 hours," she said calmly. "Pack your office. Transfer the company. Brandon is taking control of Willowmere Estate." I stared at her for several seconds because my mind genuinely refused to believe what I had just heard. "Mom," I said quietly, "my clients will be here in less than 3 hours. Whatever this is, we can discuss it another time." She folded her arms and looked at me with the same disappointment I had seen on her face throughout most of my childhood. "There is nothing to discuss. Your father made mistakes near the end of his life. It's time this family corrected one of them." At that exact moment, I understood something that would shape every decision I made afterward. She had never come to congratulate me. She hadn't come because she was proud. She had come because my success had finally become valuable enough for Brandon to want it, and my mother had arrived to make sure he got it. 3 years earlier, none of us knew that my father's final decision would eventually destroy what was left of our family. Richard Carter had spent his entire life building wealth. He owned commercial properties, investment portfolios, and businesses that people in our town admired from a distance. Growing up, everyone believed Brandon would inherit the empire one day. Honestly, so did I. My brother was the golden child from the moment he was born. Every mistake he made was explained away. Every failure became someone else's fault. Every reckless decision somehow turned into another opportunity financed by my parents. I was different. My father respected my work ethic, but my mother always reminded me that my place was to support the family, not lead it. If Brandon wanted something, everyone adjusted their lives to make sure he received it. If I wanted something, I was expected to prove I deserved it twice over. When my father passed away after a long illness, the funeral was barely over before conversations about the estate began. Friends offered condolences while relatives quietly speculated about the inheritance. Nobody asked how I was coping with losing my father. They wanted to know who would receive what. A week later, our attorney gathered us inside my father's private conference room to read his will. I can still remember the silence as every page was turned. Brandon sat beside my mother wearing a confident smile that suggested he already believed everything belonged to him. Margaret barely looked at the documents because she seemed equally certain of the outcome. I simply listened. I had spent enough years in that family to know expectations rarely worked in my favor. The attorney began listing assets one by one. Investment accounts, commercial holdings, vehicles, artwork. Then he reached the personal inheritances. Brandon inherited a fully paid luxury penthouse in Manhattan worth nearly $4 million. My mother smiled proudly before the attorney had even finished reading the paragraph. Brandon leaned back in his chair looking completely satisfied, almost bored, as though receiving millions of dollars was simply the natural order of the world. Then the attorney turned the page and looked at me. He explained that my father had left me Willowmere Estate, an abandoned property in the Hudson Valley that had once been beautiful decades earlier but had since fallen into complete neglect. The taxes alone frightened most investors away. Several structures were unsafe. The land required millions of dollars in restoration before it could ever generate a profit. The room became strangely quiet before my uncle finally laughed. He joked that my father had left Brandon a fortune and left me an expensive headache. A few others smiled politely. My mother didn't even try to hide her disappointment. As soon as the meeting ended, she pulled me aside and told me to sell the property immediately before it ruined my finances. She insisted there was no shame in admitting the estate was impossible to save. Brandon wasn't nearly as polite. He laughed and told me I would probably lose everything within a year trying to rescue a pile of collapsing buildings. According to him, successful people bought profitable businesses instead of wasting money on sentimental dreams. I didn't argue with either of them. Instead, I drove to Willowmere alone later that afternoon. The gates barely opened because rust had frozen the hinges. Tall weeds covered what had once been elegant gardens. Broken windows reflected the gray autumn sky. Part of the roof had collapsed, leaving rainwater inside the main hall. Every logical person would have seen disaster. But as I walked through the silence, something felt different. I wasn't looking at what the estate had become. I was imagining what it could become. I could almost hear conversations in restored conference rooms. I could picture weddings beneath the old oak trees. I imagined executives escaping crowded cities to find peace among these hills. For the first time since my father's death, I felt hopeful. My father had never explained why he chose me to inherit Willowmere, but standing there surrounded by broken stone walls and neglected gardens, I began to think he had left me more than a property. He had left me an opportunity that nobody else could recognize. That evening I made a decision that terrified me. I would not sell Willowmere. I would rebuild it, no matter how impossible everyone believed it was. I refinanced everything I owned, developed a long-term business plan, met with banks that rejected me more times than I could count, and eventually secured enough financing to begin the restoration. My family called me reckless. Some relatives quietly predicted bankruptcy. Brandon joked that he'd buy the land cheaply after the bank foreclosed on me. I smiled every time they underestimated me because none of them understood one simple truth. They believed they had inherited wealth. I believed I had inherited purpose. And although I didn't realize it yet, that single difference would eventually cost them everything they thought they owned. The next 3 years became the hardest and most rewarding years of my life. People often look at Willowmere today and assume I must have had investors lining up from the beginning or that someone quietly financed my dream behind the scenes. The truth is far less glamorous. During the first year, I lived in a small construction trailer parked behind what used to be the main manor because I couldn't afford to rent an apartment while paying contractors and loan installments. Every dollar mattered. I learned how to negotiate material prices, read engineering reports, understand zoning regulations, and solve problems I never imagined facing. There were mornings when I met electricians before sunrise, and nights when I was still reviewing contracts long after everyone else had gone home. My hands weren't supposed to belong to someone running a luxury hospitality company. They were scraped, bruised, and rough from carrying lumber, moving furniture, and helping crews whenever another pair of hands meant finishing, before another storm rolled through the valley. There were moments when everything nearly collapsed. A major supplier went bankrupt halfway through the renovation, forcing me to find replacement materials at almost twice the original cost. One winter, freezing temperatures damaged newly installed plumbing, delaying construction for weeks and pushing my budget dangerously close to the limit. More than once, I sat alone inside that tiny trailer staring at spreadsheets, wondering if Brandon had been right when he laughed at me. Every setback made the dream feel a little farther away, but every small victory reminded me why I refused to quit. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Willowmere began coming back to life. The broken roof disappeared beneath handcrafted slate. The abandoned gardens filled with roses, lavender, and maple trees. The crumbling barns became elegant event spaces. The old carriage house transformed into executive suites. By the end of the second year, companies had started calling to ask whether we accepted corporate retreats. We weren't even fully finished yet, but word had already begun spreading through the hospitality industry that something extraordinary was taking shape in the Hudson Valley. I still remember welcoming our very first corporate client. It wasn't a huge event, just a small leadership workshop for a regional consulting firm, but when the CEO shook my hand before leaving and told me they would definitely return, I drove back to the empty courtyard after everyone left and cried alone for nearly 20 minutes. Not because of the money, although we desperately needed it, but because someone outside my family had finally looked at something I created and believed it had value. From that day forward, bookings multiplied faster than I had ever dared to imagine. Companies recommended us to other companies. Wedding planners discovered the estate. Business magazines began featuring Willowmere as one of the most exclusive executive retreat destinations in the region. Every successful event paid another loan. Every satisfied client brought another opportunity. By the beginning of the third year, I had finally hired a full-time management team, experienced chefs, event coordinators, landscapers, and security personnel. For the first time since my father died, I could breathe without constantly wondering whether another unexpected expense would destroy everything. Yet throughout those 3 years, there was one thing that never happened. Not once did my mother call to ask how the restoration was going. Not once did Brandon offer congratulations after reading articles about Willowmere's success. They knew exactly what I had accomplished because our hometown wasn't large enough to keep something like that a secret. Friends mentioned the estate. Newspapers covered our grand reopening. Industry publications interviewed me about restoring historic properties. Still, my family remained completely silent. Looking back now, I understand why. As long as they believed Willowmere was a financial burden, they wanted nothing to do with it. The moment it became valuable, everything changed. That Saturday morning, as another sold-out corporate retreat prepared to begin, I noticed movement near the front entrance just minutes after my mother demanded that I surrender the business. A loud engine echoed across the courtyard before an old pickup truck rolled through the gates far faster than it should have. It left muddy tire tracks across the freshly cleaned gravel driveway, forcing several members of my staff to step out of the way. I didn't need to see the driver to know who it was. Brandon climbed out wearing expensive sunglasses, designer boots, and the kind of arrogant smile that only exists on people who have spent their entire lives believing consequences belong to someone else. What caught my attention wasn't him. It was the heavy crowbar resting casually in his right hand. He slammed the truck door, glanced toward the manor without really looking at it, and laughed loudly enough for several employees to hear. "I figured I'd need this to break into the old place," he shouted as he started walking toward the building. "I doubt Natalie even fixed the front doors." Then he finally looked up. I watched the exact moment his confidence disappeared. His eyes slowly moved across the restored stone facade, the perfectly maintained gardens, the luxury vehicles arriving for the executive retreat, the valet team welcoming guests, and the crystal chandeliers glowing through the enormous windows of the grand ballroom. His steps became slower. The smile vanished from his face. Even from where I stood, I could see him trying to convince himself that what he was seeing couldn't possibly be real. Brandon hadn't come expecting to inherit a thriving business. He had come expecting to claim the same abandoned estate everyone had mocked 3 years earlier. Instead, he found himself standing in front of a destination worth many times more than the penthouse he had inherited from our father. And in that single silent moment, before either of us spoke another word, I saw something in my brother's eyes that frightened me more than his arrogance ever had. It wasn't shock. It wasn't regret. It was greed. Brandon stood in the middle of my courtyard holding that crowbar like a man who had walked into the wrong life. For several seconds, he didn't speak. His eyes kept moving from the restored stone manor to the glass-walled tasting room, from the valet station to the staff members carrying trays of fresh pastries toward the executive lounge. I could see him doing the math in his head, and every number made him angrier. My mother noticed it too. Margaret's expression shifted the moment she saw Brandon's shock. She had come here expecting to command me, but now she was watching her son realize that the thing he had mocked for 3 years was worth more than anything he owned. "Put that ridiculous thing down," she snapped, but her voice was softer than before. Brandon looked at the crowbar as if he had forgotten it was in his hand. He let it fall against his leg, then forced out a laugh that sounded nothing like confidence. "Well," he said, looking around the courtyard, "I guess you finally made the old place look decent." Decent. That one word nearly made me smile. Not because it hurt, but because it showed me exactly how desperate he already was to shrink what he couldn't deny. "It's booked for the next 6 months," I said calmly. "So if you came here to break into a barn, you're 3 years too late." His face tightened. Margaret stepped between us before Brandon could answer, opened the folder she had brought, and pulled out a stack of papers clipped together with a silver binder. "Enough," she said. "This is not a personal argument. This is a legal matter." I looked at the papers, then back at her. "A legal matter you decided to announce in front of my employees an hour before clients arrive?" "Your employees?" Brandon repeated, finally finding his voice again. He walked closer, his muddy boots leaving marks across the clean stone path. "You mean the staff working on family land?" I held his stare. "They work for my company." "Your little company exists because Dad gave you land," he said. "Don't confuse luck with ownership." That sentence told me everything. Brandon hadn't come to understand what I had built. He had come to rename it as something he could take. Margaret placed the documents on the table and tapped one manicured finger against the top page. Your father left certain protections inside the family trust. Brandon and I have reviewed them carefully. If this property generates major commercial revenue, the trust has the authority to reclaim controlling oversight to protect family assets. She said it with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed the line many times before arriving. You mean, after ignoring this place for 3 years, you suddenly remembered the trust because Willowmere is profitable? Her eyes hardened. Do not be disrespectful. Brandon stepped beside her, his earlier shock now turning into open hunger. The clause is clear, Natalie. Once the estate crosses a certain revenue threshold, the trust has the right to intervene. Mom and I are trustees. You're not. He smiled then, and I saw the old Brandon return, the boy who used to break things and wait for someone else to blame me. Which means you're done playing founder. I felt the attention of my staff around us, but I refused to let embarrassment push me into anger. Anger was what they wanted. A scene would make me look unstable. A calm woman with documents and facts was far more dangerous. You haven't read those papers as carefully as you think, I said. Brandon laughed. There it is. The desperate bluff. He leaned closer, lowering his voice enough that only Margaret and I could hear him clearly. I'm giving you a chance to make this clean. Pack your office, sign the transfer documents, and I'll let you stay for a few weeks as a consultant until I understand the operation. I stared at him, almost fascinated by the arrogance. He didn't even know where the commercial kitchen breaker panels were. He didn't know which vendors required 72-hour confirmation, which clients had non-disclosure agreements, which permits protected our event spaces, or which buildings were owned by my LLC and not the trust. But he had already promoted himself to the top. Margaret softened her face into something almost maternal, which somehow made her cruelty worse. Natalie, sweetheart, this property is too large for one woman to manage alone. You've done your part. Nobody is saying you didn't try. But Brandon understands scale. He understands legacy. He can take this further than you ever could. For a moment, the courtyard around me seemed to fade. I was 13 again, standing in our kitchen with a science award hidden behind my back because Brandon had failed another math test and my mother didn't want me making him feel inadequate. I was 21 again, getting into a graduate program while Margaret reminded me that Brandon needed encouragement more than I needed praise. I was 34 now, standing on a property I had resurrected, listening to the same message in a more expensive coat. Make yourself smaller, so your brother can feel bigger. But something inside me had finally stopped obeying. I picked up the papers and flipped through them slowly. The clause existed, just as Brandon said. My father had added language allowing the family trust to protect raw land from reckless outside development. It had been designed to stop a stranger from buying the property and destroying it. Brandon believed that clause made him powerful. He didn't understand that my entire business had been built around it. The land was one thing. The company, the restoration contracts, the commercial permits, the client agreements, the equipment, the brand, and the operating rights were another. Every painful legal bill I had paid during those 3 years suddenly felt worth it. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. No. Margaret blinked. Excuse me? No, I repeated. I am not signing anything. I am not stepping aside. Brandon is not taking over my company. Brandon's jaw clenched. Then I'll call the sheriff. I'll have the gates locked and your event shut down before lunch. He lifted the crowbar slightly, not enough to threaten me openly, but enough to remind me what kind of man he was becoming. You think these executives will come back after they watch your family remove you from the premises? My heart was beating hard, but my voice stayed even. Do what you think you have to do. Margaret stared at me as if I had slapped her. She had expected resistance, maybe tears, maybe pleading, but not this, not calm refusal. Brandon snatched the folder from the table and shoved it under his arm. You have 48 hours, he said. After that, I take control with or without your permission. Then he turned toward the manor, staring at it again with the naked greed he could no longer hide. And as I watched him look at my life's work like a meal he had already decided to devour, I understood that this was no longer about inheritance. This was going to be a war. I wish I could tell you that I wasn't afraid after Brandon and my mother left that morning, but that wouldn't be true. The moment their truck disappeared beyond the front gate, I finally allowed myself to exhale. My hands were trembling so badly that I had to place them on the stone table to keep anyone from noticing. I had just refused the two people who had controlled most of my life, and for the first time, I hadn't apologized for it. My event director quietly walked over and asked if everything was all right. Several members of my staff had witnessed enough of the confrontation to understand that something serious was happening, but they also knew better than to ask questions. I smiled, thanked them for staying focused, and told everyone to continue preparing for the executive retreat. If my family wanted to destroy my business, I wasn't going to help them by letting today's event fall apart. Within minutes, the courtyard came back to life. Valets welcomed arriving guests. The catering team rolled breakfast stations into the ballroom, and executives began stepping out of luxury SUVs without the slightest idea that my family had just declared war on me. I greeted every client with the same confidence I always had, shook hands, answered questions, and made sure each guest felt welcomed. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, my mind was racing through every legal document I had signed during the past 3 years. My father had taught me something long before he became sick. He used to say that emotions make people react, but paperwork decides who wins. I remember those words because they echoed in my mind all morning. Brandon believed he had discovered a shortcut to taking Willowmere. I needed to know exactly what he had actually found. The moment our conference officially began and my management team had everything under control, I walked into my office, closed the door, and picked up my phone. There was only one person I trusted to tell me the truth, even if I didn't want to hear it. Daniel, I said as soon as he answered. I need you at Willowmere today. He immediately recognized something in my voice. What's happened? My mother and Brandon showed up with trust documents. They believe they can take the estate. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. Don't sign anything. I didn't. Good. I'm leaving my office now. Give me 45 minutes. Daniel Brooks had represented my company since the very beginning. Before Willowmere officially opened, every contract, every permit, every financing agreement, every operating license had passed across his desk. He wasn't just my attorney. He understood every legal decision I had made while rebuilding the estate, including several that even I hadn't fully appreciated at the time. While I waited for him to arrive, I unlocked the fireproof cabinet beside my desk and began pulling out thick binders containing 3 years of contracts, property records, construction permits, insurance policies, loan agreements, vendor contracts, trademark registrations, and corporate filings. The stack became so large that it covered nearly half my conference table. Looking at those documents reminded me of every sacrifice hidden behind them. Every signature represented another risk I had taken when nobody else believed in me. About 40 minutes later, Daniel walked into my office carrying nothing except a leather briefcase and a legal pad. He didn't waste time asking how I felt. That was one thing I appreciated about him. He believed problems should be understood before emotions were discussed. I handed him the folder Margaret had left behind. He spent nearly 15 minutes reading every page without saying a single word. Occasionally, he underlined a sentence with his pen or flipped back to compare one section with another. Finally, he closed the folder and looked directly at me. Now I understand why Brandon is so confident, he said. Which means they're right, I asked quietly. He smiled for the first time that day. No, it means they've only read half the story. I frowned. Daniel stood, walked over to the conference table, and separated the documents into 2 neat piles. This, he said, placing one hand on the trust paperwork, covers the land your father left you. Then he placed his other hand on the much larger stack of business records. This is everything you built afterward. I stared at him without speaking. Brandon believes these are the same thing, Daniel continued. Legally, they aren't even close. He began explaining what I had almost forgotten after years of signing paperwork. Willowmere Estate and Willowmere Retreat Group LLC were separate legal entities. The trust owned certain rights connected to the original land. My company owned the restored buildings, the hospitality business, the operating licenses, the client contracts, the trademarks, the reservation system, the equipment, the brand itself, and nearly every improvement made during the restoration. Even if Brandon somehow forced control over portions of the land through the trust, he couldn't simply seize the business that operated on it. My father had protected the estate. I had unknowingly protected everything else. Daniel looked at me with complete confidence. Natalie, your brother believes he's walking into a finished victory. He's actually walking into one of the most complicated corporate structures I've ever helped create. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the first real sense of relief I'd experienced all day. So he can't take Willowmere? Daniel shook his head slowly. He can certainly make your life miserable. He can file lawsuits. He can delay projects. He can create expensive legal battles. But walking in and taking your company? He smiled again. Not unless you decide to give it to him. That single sentence changed the way I looked at the fight ahead. Until that moment, I had been thinking about defending myself. Daniel helped me realize something far more important. I wasn't defending a dream anymore. I was defending a business that was built on 3 years of careful planning, legal preparation, and decisions my family had never bothered to understand. As Daniel organized the documents into new folders, my phone vibrated on the table. The caller ID showed Brandon. I let it ring until it stopped. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Enjoy your little victory while it lasts. By the end of the week, Willowmere will belong to me. I read the message twice before quietly placing the phone face down. Daniel noticed the expression on my face but didn't ask to see it. He simply closed his briefcase and said, "People who know they're winning don't send threats, Natalie. They send paperwork." Looking back now, I should have realized that Brandon's message wasn't confidence. It was desperation. And desperate people almost always make the mistakes that destroy them. 2 days passed without another visit from my mother or Brandon. But the silence wasn't comforting. It felt calculated. Brandon had always mistaken quiet for strategy. Growing up, whenever he disappeared after losing an argument, it usually meant he was looking for someone stronger to solve his problem for him. This time, that someone was my mother. Daniel had already warned me to expect another move, so I wasn't surprised when my phone rang just after sunrise on Monday. The caller ID showed Margaret. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was unusually calm, almost pleasant, which immediately put me on guard. "We're having dinner tonight," she said. 6 o'clock. The family will be there. I almost laughed. We hadn't had a genuine family dinner in years. "I'm working. Cancel it. I have clients. This is more important." There it was again. That quiet certainty that everyone else's life should simply rearrange itself around Brandon's needs. "What's this really about?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "It's time to settle this before lawyers make everything ugly." I looked across my office at Daniel, who had been reviewing another stack of documents. He raised an eyebrow, silently asking who was calling. I mouthed, "My mother." He immediately understood. When I repeated the invitation, he thought for a moment before nodding once. "Go," he whispered. "But say as little as possible. Let them talk." That advice turned out to be one of the smartest decisions we made. At exactly 6 o'clock that evening, I walked into the dining room of my parents' house, a place I hadn't entered since my father's funeral. Almost nothing had changed. My father's portrait still hung above the fireplace. The antique dining table still occupied the center of the room. The only difference was that his chair now sat empty, and somehow the entire house felt colder because of it. Brandon was already there, leaning comfortably in Father's old seat as though he had promoted himself before anyone else had noticed. That single image told me everything about how he saw himself. My mother greeted me with a forced smile, kissed my cheek as though nothing had happened 48 hours earlier, and asked me to sit. Around the table were 2 of my uncles, an aunt, and my cousin Ryan. I hadn't expected an audience, but perhaps I should have. Margaret had always preferred winning arguments with witnesses present. Dinner lasted less than 10 minutes before the real conversation began. My mother carefully placed her napkin beside her plate and folded her hands together. Natalie, she began, everyone here agrees this conflict has gone on long enough. I glanced around the table. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked directly at me. They simply waited. Brandon leaned back in Father's chair and smiled. You built something impressive, he admitted. I'll give you that. It was the first compliment he had ever given me in my entire life, which meant it wasn't a compliment at all. But running a successful property isn't the same as growing a real development company, he continued. Willowmere is sitting on hundreds of acres of underused land. I stayed silent. Daniel's advice echoed in my mind. Let him talk. Brandon reached into his briefcase and spread several architectural renderings across the table. Luxury condominium towers, retail space, underground parking, private fitness centers. Every drawing replaced the gardens, walking trails, vineyards, and historic buildings I had spent 3 years restoring. My stomach tightened as I realized what I was looking at. He didn't want my business. He wanted to erase it. I've already spoken with developers, he said confidently. The land alone could generate 3 times what your retreat business makes over the next decade. Margaret nodded proudly. This is the kind of vision your father always wanted. I almost interrupted, but I stopped myself. My father had personally rejected similar proposals years before because preserving Willowmere's historic character mattered deeply to him. Brandon either didn't know that or didn't care, probably both. One of my uncles finally spoke. Seems like good business, Natalie. Another relative added, You'd still make money. I looked around the table and realized none of them understood what Willowmere actually was. They saw land. I saw thousands of memories created by guests who trusted us with their weddings, leadership retreats, charity events, and family celebrations. They saw acreage. I saw a promise I had made to my father the day I decided not to sell the estate. Brandon slid another document toward me. Here's the proposal, he said. You sign over operational control. I'll handle redevelopment, and once construction begins, I'll make sure you receive a generous consulting contract. Consulting contract. 3 years of sacrifice reduced to an employee position inside my own dream. I finally looked directly at him. Have you ever asked yourself why Willowmere became successful? He shrugged. Location? No. The market? No. He frowned. Then what? I leaned forward. Because people come there to escape places that look exactly like the ones you're planning to build. The room fell silent. Brandon laughed dismissively. You're thinking emotionally. I'm thinking like someone who actually knows the business. His smile disappeared. You're thinking too small. That sentence stayed with me because it perfectly captured who Brandon had become. He believed bigger automatically meant better. More buildings, more money, more concrete. He never understood that value isn't measured only by size. Sometimes it's measured by what you refuse to destroy. Margaret suddenly lost the calm tone she had been carefully maintaining. Enough of this, she snapped. Your brother is trying to save this family from another one of your emotional decisions. I looked at her quietly. Is that what this is really about? What do you mean? How much money does Brandon need? The question hit the room like broken glass. Brandon's head snapped toward me. Margaret froze. Neither of them answered immediately, and that silence told me more than any explanation ever could. Brandon recovered first, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully artificial. I don't need anything. Then why are you trying so hard to sell land you mocked 3 years ago? His jaw tightened. Because I'm smarter than you. I held his gaze for several seconds before standing up from the table. No, I said calmly. Because you're desperate. Nobody spoke. Even my uncles avoided looking at Brandon. As I picked up my coat, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Several unopened collection notices were stacked carelessly on the hallway console near the front door. They weren't hidden. They had simply been turned upside down too quickly. Most people would have walked past them without thinking. I didn't. Years of building a business had taught me to notice small details. I walked out of the house without another word, but during the drive back to Willowmere, one thought refused to leave my mind. Brandon wasn't trying to take my company because he wanted success. He was trying to take it because something in his own life was collapsing. And if I wanted to understand what he would do next, I first needed to discover exactly what he was trying so desperately to hide. The drive back to Willowmere that night was unusually quiet. I turned off the radio somewhere along the highway because I needed to hear my own thoughts. Brandon's reaction at dinner kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't what he said that bothered me. It was what he refused to answer. I've spent enough years negotiating contracts to recognize when someone is hiding the real problem. The moment I asked how much money he needed, his confidence disappeared for just a second. Most people would never have noticed it. I did. By the time I reached the estate, I wasn't thinking about the trust anymore. I was thinking about debt. The following morning, I asked Daniel to come by my office before our first meeting. He arrived carrying coffee instead of legal files, which usually meant he had already guessed what I was about to ask. "You think Brandon's broke?" he said before I even opened my mouth. I nodded. "Not just struggling, desperate." Daniel leaned back in his chair. I was starting to wonder the same thing after reading those trust documents. None of this makes financial sense unless he needs cash immediately. Can we prove it? He thought for a moment before answering. Not directly. Financial records aren't public unless something has already gone wrong. But I know someone who specializes in following money after people try to hide it. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed a business card, and slid it across my desk. The name printed in dark blue letters read Michael Grant, forensic accountant and financial investigator. "If Brandon has buried himself in debt," Daniel said, "Michael will find the shovel." I called Michael that afternoon. His voice was calm, almost detached, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who trusted numbers more than people. He didn't promise miracles. He simply asked me one question. "Do you want confirmation, or do you want the whole truth?" "The whole truth," I answered. "Be careful what you wish for," he replied before ending the call. 4 days passed. Life at Willowmere continued as though nothing had happened. We hosted conferences, weddings, charity dinners, and executive retreats without a single client suspecting that my family was trying to seize the business. Outwardly, I remained exactly the same. Inwardly, every phone call made my heart beat a little faster. Then, early Friday morning, Michael arrived. He carried a thin black folder instead of the thick binders I expected. When he entered my office, he closed the door behind him before saying a single word. "Your brother isn't wealthy anymore." I felt my stomach tighten. "How bad?" He opened the folder. "Worse than you probably imagined." He placed the first document in front of me. Brandon had refinanced the Manhattan penthouse my father left him less than 18 months after inheriting it. 6 months later, he refinanced it again. Then came private loans secured against investment accounts that no longer existed, luxury car leases, high-interest commercial credit, personal guarantees for speculative real estate deals that had failed before construction even began. Every page revealed another financial decision built on the assumption that more money would somehow appear before the bills became due. He borrowed against almost everything he owned, Michael explained. When the market slowed, several projects collapsed. Investors walked away. The banks didn't. I kept turning pages. The numbers became larger. The overdue notices became more frequent. Collection actions. Default warnings. Legal demands. Then Michael slid one final document toward me. "This," he said quietly, "is why your mother is involved." I looked down and immediately recognized my parents' home address. Margaret Carter had quietly taken out a mortgage against the family house 6 months earlier. Every dollar had been transferred into accounts connected to Brandon's failing companies. I read the figures twice because I couldn't believe them. My mother hadn't come to Willowmere to protect family tradition. She had come because she had already sacrificed everything else trying to rescue Brandon, and it still wasn't enough. "Does she know how bad it is?" I asked. Michael gave a slow nod. "She knows enough to be frightened." I leaned back in my chair, suddenly understanding pieces of the puzzle that hadn't fit before. The expensive legal threats, the sudden urgency, the impossible 48-hour deadline, the redevelopment plans. None of it had anything to do with preserving my father's legacy. Brandon needed immediate liquidity. Selling Willowmere to developers would generate enough money to pay his creditors before they destroyed him publicly. "There's more," Michael said. He removed another sheet from the folder. 3 of Brandon's largest loans mature within 6 weeks. If he can't repay them, the lenders can force liquidation proceedings. 6 weeks. Suddenly, everything accelerated inside my mind. Brandon wasn't planning for the future. He was racing against a clock I hadn't even known existed. Every threat he made suddenly carried a completely different meaning. He wasn't attacking because he was strong. He was attacking because time was running out. Michael watched me carefully before speaking again. People under this kind of financial pressure usually become unpredictable. Logic stops driving their decisions. Survival does. I stared through the office window toward the gardens outside where guests were laughing as they walked between the fountains. They had no idea that a financial disaster was quietly approaching the estate from the outside. "Do you think he'll stop?" I asked. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder and stood. "Natalie," he said, "men who owe this much money don't walk away from the only asset they believe can save them." After he left, I remained alone in my office for nearly an hour. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about my father. He had trusted Brandon with a fortune, and in just 3 years, my brother had managed to turn millions of dollars into desperation. Meanwhile, the abandoned estate everyone mocked had become the only thing standing between Brandon and complete financial ruin. That irony would have made my father shake his head. But what frightened me wasn't what Brandon had already lost. It was what he was willing to do next to avoid losing everything else. I barely slept after Michael left my office. His report sat on my desk long after everyone else had gone home, and I must have read it 10 times that night. Every page confirmed the same truth. Brandon wasn't fighting for our father's legacy. He was fighting a deadline. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something else. Men who are cornered financially rarely stop after their first plan fails. They immediately move to the next one, and that next move is usually far more dangerous. By sunrise, I had already decided that reacting wasn't enough anymore. For the first time since my mother walked into Willowmere demanding my company, I needed to stop defending myself and start understanding exactly how Brandon intended to attack. I asked Daniel and Michael to meet me in my office before the first guests finished breakfast. Neither of them looked surprised when I told them what I was thinking. "He's running out of time," I said. "If he can't force me into signing those papers, he'll find another way to convince people that Willowmere belongs to him." Daniel nodded slowly. "Which means we stop waiting." Michael opened his notebook. "Let's think like Brandon. If you needed millions of dollars within a few weeks, what would you do?" We spent nearly an hour mapping every possibility onto the conference room whiteboard. Lawsuits, fake ownership claims, pressure from lenders, anonymous complaints to government agencies, attempts to scare investors, attempts to frighten clients away. Even if only one of those strategies worked, Brandon wouldn't need to win permanently. He only needed to damage Willowmere enough to force me into a desperate negotiation. That realization changed everything. "We're assuming he'll attack legally," I finally said. "But Brandon has never solved problems with patience. He solves them by making someone else panic." Michael looked up immediately. "Exactly." Daniel uncapped a marker and circled one phrase in the center of the board. "Control the narrative." "The first person to tell the story usually shapes how everyone else sees it," he said. "If Brandon convinces investors, clients, or local officials that ownership is under dispute, people may hesitate before doing business with you, even if you're legally right." That sentence stayed with me. I suddenly remembered the confidence in Brandon's voice when he threatened to shut down my event. He hadn't sounded like a man planning a lawsuit. He had sounded like someone already talking to other people behind my back. I opened my laptop and logged into our reservation system. Willowmere was almost fully booked for the next 7 months. Hundreds of guests, dozens of corporate contracts, and several high-profile charity events depended on our reputation remaining stable. Brandon couldn't destroy the business overnight, but he didn't have to. If enough clients became uncertain, they would simply choose another venue. Fear spreads faster than facts. We need to protect every relationship we already have, I said. Before Daniel could answer, my office phone rang. My assistant informed me that two men were waiting at the front reception asking detailed questions about ownership of the estate. They claimed to represent an investment group interested in purchasing the property. I looked at Daniel. He looked at Michael. None of us believed the timing was a coincidence. Ask them to wait, I told my assistant. A few minutes later, the three of us walked into the reception hall together. The two men introduced themselves politely enough, but something about the conversation immediately felt rehearsed. They weren't asking about conference facilities or future development opportunities. Every question centered on ownership. Was the property involved in litigation? Was management expected to change? Was it true that another family member would soon become the controlling operator? They watched my face carefully after each question, almost as if they hoped I would accidentally confirm something. I answered calmly without volunteering any information. When the meeting ended, one of them handed me a business card before leaving. The company name sounded legitimate, but Michael quietly photographed the card the moment they walked out. Less than an hour later, he returned to my office carrying his laptop. "They're not investors," he said. "At least not in the way they claimed." He turned the screen toward me. The so-called investment company had been incorporated only 3 months earlier. It had no completed projects, almost no public history, and one of its directors had previously worked with a real estate firm that Brandon had unsuccessfully tried to partner with the year before. Daniel folded his arms. "He's shopping the property before he owns it." I felt a chill run through me. Brandon wasn't simply dreaming about redevelopment anymore. He was already presenting Willowmere to potential buyers as though taking control was inevitable. He wasn't waiting for permission, he was selling confidence. That afternoon, another message appeared on my phone. It came from Brandon. "Enjoy the bookings while you can. New management always brings new opportunities." I read it once before deleting it. 6 days earlier, I would have felt intimidated. Now I saw something completely different. Every move Brandon made was becoming more reckless. Every lie required another lie to support it. Every promise he made to outsiders increased the pressure on him to actually deliver Willowmere. He wasn't building leverage anymore. He was building a trap, and the longer he continued pretending he already owned my company, the harder he would fall when reality finally caught up with him. I didn't know exactly when that moment would come, but for the first time since this battle began, I stopped wondering whether Brandon would make a mistake. I started wondering how big that mistake was going to be. 3 days after those fake investors visited Willowmere, I received the confirmation I had been expecting, although I had hoped it would take Brandon a little longer to cross the next line. It was just after 8 in the morning when Daniel called before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. I could hear traffic in the background, which meant he was already driving. "Don't panic," he said immediately. "I'm on my way." Those 4 words told me enough to know something serious had happened. "What's going on?" I asked. "I just received a courtesy call from someone at the county records office. Brandon filed a formal notice claiming there's an ownership dispute involving Willowmere." I closed my eyes for a second. "Can he do that?" "Anyone can file a claim," Daniel replied. "Winning it is another matter. The problem isn't the filing. The problem is the attention it creates." 20 minutes later, Daniel and I were sitting in my office reviewing the paperwork. Brandon hadn't claimed he already owned Willowmere because even he knew that argument wouldn't survive 5 minutes in court. Instead, he had used the trust documents to create enough uncertainty that lenders, vendors, insurers, and future business partners might hesitate until everything was resolved. It was exactly the kind of move someone would make if they needed time rather than justice. "He's trying to freeze your momentum," Daniel said. "Every delayed contract buys him another day to solve his own financial disaster." Before I could answer, my assistant knocked on the office door. "Natalie," she said carefully, "our insurance carrier is on line 2. They want to discuss the ownership filing." I thanked her and picked up the phone. The representative remained polite throughout the conversation, but the message was obvious. They weren't canceling our policy. They simply wanted written confirmation that no legal changes affected operational control. 30 minutes later, one of our largest corporate clients requested a meeting to ask almost the exact same questions. By lunchtime, two vendors had postponed signing new contracts until the situation became clearer. Daniel had predicted every single step. Brandon wasn't attacking the estate itself. He was attacking confidence. That afternoon, Michael arrived with another update. "Your brother is getting more desperate," he said before sitting down. "Why?" I asked. He handed me several printed emails obtained through legal investigative channels. One lender had rejected Brandon's request for an emergency extension. Another had demanded immediate repayment of a personal guarantee connected to one of his failed development projects. A third warned that legal recovery proceedings would begin within 14 days if no payment was received. 14 days. The clock was moving even faster than we had originally believed. Michael pointed to one particular figure highlighted in yellow. "This payment alone is larger than all the liquid cash Brandon currently has available." I looked at the number in silence. It explained everything. He wasn't trying to build a future anymore. He was trying to survive the next 2 weeks. Daniel slowly tapped his pen against the table. "Cornered people become impatient." Michael nodded. "And impatient people make expensive mistakes." Neither of them knew how quickly that prediction would come true. The following morning, one of my security supervisors entered my office carrying a small envelope. "This was left at the front gate overnight," he explained. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with no signature. It contained only one sentence: "You should sell before the government shuts you down." Most people would have dismissed it as a childish threat. I didn't. Anonymous messages almost always appear when someone wants to frighten you without leaving fingerprints. I asked security to preserve the envelope and forward every surveillance recording from the previous 12 hours to our archive. Nothing obvious appeared on camera, but I had learned long ago that evidence often becomes valuable only after other pieces fall into place. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time, it was the county building department requesting access to Willowmere for an urgent inspection based on a recently filed safety complaint. I thanked the inspector, confirmed a convenient time, and ended the call. Daniel looked at me without saying anything. We were both thinking the same thing. Brandon had moved to the next stage of his plan. If he couldn't convince people that he already owned Willowmere, he would try to convince them it wasn't safe to operate. I almost laughed because he had unknowingly chosen the worst possible strategy. During the restoration, I had insisted that every permit, every inspection, every structural report, every electrical certification, every fire safety approval, and every environmental compliance document be completed beyond the minimum legal requirements. At the time, many contractors complained that I was wasting money. My answer had always been the same: "I'd rather spend extra today than regret shortcuts tomorrow." Standing in my office that afternoon, I realized those expensive decisions were about to become my greatest protection. Brandon believed he was creating pressure. What he didn't realize was that every false accusation forced independent professionals to verify that Willowmere had been built exactly the way it should have been. The more authorities examined my business, the stronger my position would become. I looked out across the estate, where guests were enjoying lunch beneath the old oak trees, completely unaware of the battle unfolding around them. For the first time since my mother walked through those front gates, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before: confidence. Brandon still believed this fight was about who could shout the loudest. I knew it was about who had prepared the longest. And preparation has a remarkable way of exposing people who have spent their entire lives relying on shortcuts. 1 week after Brandon filed the ownership dispute, the inspection notice finally became real. At exactly 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, 3 county vehicles drove through the front gates of Willowmere. My staff looked nervous, but I had already prepared them. I reminded everyone to treat the inspectors with the same professionalism we showed every guest. If Brandon wanted chaos, I wasn't going to give it to him. A man in his late 50s stepped out of the lead vehicle, introduced himself as Kevin Doyle from the county building department, and politely explained that his office had received several anonymous complaints alleging structural hazards, fire code violations, and unauthorized renovations throughout the estate. I smiled, shook his hand, and invited him inside. "We'll cooperate with anything you need," I said. He seemed almost surprised by my response. I suspected he had expected resistance. Instead, I handed him a complete binder containing every construction permit, engineering certification, fire inspection report, occupancy approval, environmental clearance, and safety audit completed during the restoration. Daniel had helped organize the documents the previous evening in anticipation of exactly this moment. Kevin flipped through the binder for several seconds before looking back at me. "Most property owners don't keep records this organized. Most property owners didn't spend 3 years rebuilding an abandoned estate," I replied. The inspection lasted nearly 4 hours. Kevin and 2 additional inspectors examined electrical rooms, emergency exits, commercial kitchens, guest suites, sprinkler systems, elevators, structural supports, and mechanical equipment. They measured distances, reviewed maintenance logs, tested alarms, and compared serial numbers against permit records. I followed them quietly without interrupting. The longer the inspection continued, the more I noticed Kevin's confidence beginning to fade. By early afternoon, one of the junior inspectors quietly walked over and whispered something to him. Kevin frowned before asking if he could review the original engineering reports one more time. I immediately provided them. Daniel, who had remained nearby throughout the inspection, leaned toward me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. "He's looking for something, or hoping to find something," I answered. Another hour passed before Kevin finally closed his notebook. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "everything appears to be in excellent condition." I nodded politely but said nothing. He continued speaking. "There are a few minor recommendations regarding future maintenance schedules, but none of them affect your operating permits." Exactly as Daniel had predicted, Brandon hadn't delayed my business. He had unintentionally created another official record confirming Willowmere exceeded county requirements. As the inspectors prepared to leave, Kevin hesitated near the entrance. He looked back toward the courtyard as though debating whether to say something. Finally, he lowered his voice. "Off the record, someone was unusually persistent about getting us out here quickly." I met his eyes without responding. He gave the slightest nod before walking away. That was all I needed. He couldn't accuse anyone directly, but his message was perfectly clear. The complaints hadn't been filed by concerned neighbors. Someone wanted government agencies to pressure my business. The moment the county vehicles disappeared through the gates, Daniel turned toward me. "Now we document everything." We immediately created a complete timeline beginning with my mother's first visit, the trust documents, the fake investors, the ownership filing, the anonymous threats, and finally the inspection triggered by unsupported complaints. Separately, each incident looked inconvenient. Together they formed a pattern. "If Brandon keeps escalating," Daniel said, "this timeline becomes very valuable." He was right, but something else was bothering me. Brandon wasn't getting what he wanted. Every attempt was failing. Every official review ended in my favor. Every delay pushed him closer to his own financial collapse. Desperate people rarely become more careful after repeated failures. They become reckless. Later that evening, Michael called with another update. His voice sounded more serious than usual. "One of Brandon's lenders has started preparing litigation." I closed my office door before answering. "How much time does he have now?" "Less than 2 weeks." "Can he still refinance?" "No bank will touch him anymore." I leaned against my desk, staring through the window at the lights surrounding Willowmere. Guests laughed outside as they gathered around the fire pit. Weddings were being planned months in advance. Employees were building careers. Families were making memories. Everything I had created continued moving forward while Brandon's world was collapsing behind the scenes. Michael interrupted my thoughts. "There's something else." "What?" "Brandon requested another private meeting with a development group yesterday." My heart sank slightly. "The same people who sent fake investors?" "No, bigger." "Did they agree?" "Not exactly." He paused. "But according to my source, Brandon promised them he would control Willowmere within days." I closed my eyes for a moment. He wasn't just lying to me anymore. He was lying to banks, developers, investors, and anyone willing to believe him. Every promise increased the pressure on him to deliver something he didn't own. Every lie narrowed his options. "He's running out of road," Michael said quietly. "Yes," I answered, "and men like Brandon usually don't stop before the cliff." After we ended the call, I walked alone through the gardens for nearly an hour. The estate looked peaceful beneath the evening lights, almost untouched by everything happening around it. I thought about my father and the day he handed me a property everyone else considered worthless. I wondered whether he had somehow known I would need to become stronger than the family I was born into. I didn't hate Brandon anymore. I pitied him. Somewhere along the way, he had become so convinced that success could be taken from someone else that he never learned how to build it for himself. And as I stood beneath the old oak trees that night, I realized our battle had quietly reached a turning point. Until now, Brandon had been chasing my business. From this moment forward, he would be running from the consequences of everything he had already done. It didn't take long for Daniel's prediction to come true. Brandon had reached the point where patience no longer existed. Every legal tactic had failed. The ownership dispute wasn't stopping my business. The inspection had only strengthened my credibility. Investors weren't lining up behind him, and according to Michael, his creditors were becoming more aggressive every day. Looking back now, I realized something important about desperate people. They eventually stop trying to win fairly. They begin looking for ways to make everyone else lose with them. About a week after the county inspection, Willowmere was preparing for one of the largest weddings we had ever hosted. More than 300 guests were expected to arrive that Saturday afternoon. The bride's family had booked the estate nearly 14 months earlier, and they had chosen Willowmere because they wanted an outdoor ceremony overlooking the lake followed by an evening reception inside the restored grand ballroom. Every room on the property was occupied. Florists had been working since dawn. Lucas Bennett, our executive chef, had spent 2 days preparing a custom menu with his kitchen staff. My event managers checked every detail 3 separate times because that was simply how we operated. Nothing about the day suggested trouble. Around 10 that morning, Lucas knocked on my office door with an unusual expression on his face. "Natalie," he said quietly, "our backup refrigeration unit shut itself down for about 20 minutes during the night." I frowned. "Mechanical failure?" He shook his head. "Maintenance can't figure it out. Everything restarted normally before sunrise." It sounded strange, but equipment occasionally malfunctioned, especially during busy seasons. I asked him to document everything anyway. Years of running Willowmere had taught me that small problems sometimes became important later. By early afternoon, the ceremony was less than 3 hours away when my facilities manager rushed toward me across the courtyard. I knew something was wrong before he even spoke. "The emergency generator won't start," he said, breathing heavily. "What do you mean it won't start?" "Someone disconnected the primary fuel supply." I stared at him for a second. "Accident?" He shook his head immediately. "No, the connection was removed manually." My heartbeat quickened, but years of managing large events forced me to stay calm. "Panic spreads faster than fire. How long to reconnect it?" "We're working on it now." "Good. Don't tell the guests anything." He ran back toward the utility building while I immediately called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Someone tampered with our backup generator," I said. There was a brief silence. "Don't touch anything else," he replied. "Photograph everything exactly as it is before maintenance finishes the repair." Within minutes, every disconnected valve, every loose fitting, and every tool left behind had been photographed from multiple angles. Daniel had drilled that habit into me from the beginning. Preserve first, repair second. While maintenance restored the fuel line, another employee hurried toward me. "Natalie." The ballroom lights flickered twice. I looked toward the building. Guests hadn't noticed yet, but I had. 2 unrelated equipment failures on the same day were no longer a coincidence. They were a message. Fortunately, Willowmere had been designed with multiple redundant systems. During construction, I insisted on installing a secondary backup generator in a separate secured utility building, even though several contractors argued it was unnecessary. At the time, I simply wanted additional protection against storms. That expensive decision suddenly became one of the smartest investments I had ever made. Within 20 minutes, power redundancy had been fully restored. Refrigeration was operating normally, and not a single guest realized anything unusual had happened. The wedding proceeded exactly on schedule. Watching the bride walk down the aisle that afternoon, smiling without the slightest idea how close someone had come to disrupting the most important day of her life, reminded me why I had fought so hard to build Willowmere in the first place. My family saw property. I saw responsibility. That evening, after the reception ended successfully, Daniel arrived with Michael. We met inside the security office where our surveillance manager had already gathered recordings from every camera covering the service roads, maintenance buildings, loading docks, and utility areas. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing footage from the previous 24 hours. Most of it showed exactly what we expected: vendors making deliveries, employees moving equipment, wedding planners decorating reception areas. Then, just after 2:30 that morning, one camera captured movement near the utility building. A hooded figure entered through an employee access gate, remained out of sight for several minutes, and left carrying what appeared to be a small toolbox. The face wasn't visible, but the timing matched the generator sabotage almost perfectly. Michael paused the recording several times, studying the person's height, posture, and movement. "Professional?" I asked. He slowly shook his head. "No. Then what?" "Someone who knows enough to damage equipment but not enough to avoid cameras." Daniel looked at me. "Which means whoever did this expected the sabotage itself to matter more than being identified later." We continued reviewing footage until another camera captured the same person climbing into a dark SUV parked several streets away from Willowmere. The license plate wasn't readable, but one detail immediately caught Michael's attention. A distinctive chrome dealer emblem was attached to the rear of the vehicle. He quietly took a screenshot. "Give me until tomorrow," he said. "I think I know where to start." After they left, I remained alone inside the security office, watching the empty courtyard on the monitors. The wedding had been perfect. Hundreds of guests had gone home believing the day unfolded without a single problem. They would never know how close someone had come to ruining it. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something else entirely. Brandon had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Until now, he had attacked paperwork, reputation, and legal ownership. Someone had now sabotaged equipment that protected hundreds of people attending a major event. Whether Brandon had done it himself or convinced someone else to do it no longer mattered. The fight was no longer about an inheritance. It had become a question of how far a desperate man was willing to go before he destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of innocent people standing in his way. The next morning, I woke up with one question repeating in my mind. If someone had been willing to sabotage equipment that protected hundreds of guests, what would they try next after realizing they had failed? People like Brandon rarely accepted defeat. They simply looked for another door. By the time I arrived at Willowmere, Michael was already waiting outside my office with a laptop under one arm and a folder in his hand. The moment I saw his expression, I knew he had found something important. He didn't waste time with small talk. He placed a still image from the security footage on my desk. It showed the dark SUV parked several streets away from the estate. The license plate was unreadable, but the chrome dealer emblem mounted beneath it wasn't. "I tracked the dealership," Michael said. "Only 37 vehicles were sold with that exact emblem during the past 2 years." He opened another page. After narrowing the color, model, and registration area, we're down to 3 possible owners. I leaned forward. "Any names I recognize?" He nodded slowly. "One of them works for a private security contractor. One is a retired electrician. The third," he paused for a second, "is employed by a construction company that Brandon hired less than 8 months ago." I didn't say anything. I simply looked at the report while Daniel quietly folded his arms beside me. Michael continued. "I can't prove the driver was that employee. Not yet. but the connection is too close to ignore. Daniel immediately stepped in before either of us jumped to conclusions. Then we don't accuse anyone. He looked directly at me. Remember what we've done from the beginning. Facts first, assumptions never. He was right. Brandon had already made enough reckless decisions. We weren't going to make the same mistake. Instead of chasing him, we focused on strengthening Willowmere. Every utility room received upgraded electronic locks. Employee access cards were reprogrammed. Exterior lighting was expanded around the maintenance buildings, and every camera angle was reviewed to eliminate blind spots we had never noticed before. Ethan Cole arrived later that afternoon after Daniel asked him to perform a complete security assessment of the estate. Ethan had overseen our digital security systems since Willowmere opened, but until then his work had focused mostly on protecting client information, reservation systems, and financial records. Physical security had never been his primary concern because, quite honestly, we had never imagined needing it. Ethan spent nearly 6 hours inspecting our network, surveillance equipment, server room, and access control systems before asking me a question I hadn't expected. "Natalie," he said, "if Brandon can't damage the property itself, what information would hurt you the most if he stole it?" I thought about it for a moment. "Client contracts." He nodded. "Anything else?" "Financial records." "Anything else?" Then it hit me. "Architectural plans, vendor agreements, employee information, insurance policies." Ethan smiled slightly. "Exactly. A business isn't just buildings. Sometimes the fastest way to destroy it is to steal what keeps it running." That evening, we moved every critical digital archive onto a new encrypted server located inside a secure room, accessible only through biometric authentication. Multiple offline backups were created and stored in separate locations. Ethan also installed silent alerts that would notify him immediately if anyone attempted unauthorized access to sensitive files. I watched him work with quiet admiration. Unlike Brandon, Ethan never believed in shortcuts. Every layer of protection existed because he assumed someone would eventually test it. Before leaving, he turned toward me. "There's one more thing I'd like to do." "What is it?" "Leave something for Brandon to find." I frowned. "A trap?" "A legal one." Daniel looked interested immediately. Ethan opened his laptop and displayed a proposed server architecture. One machine would appear to contain everything: financial statements, ownership records, development plans, client databases, banking information, but in reality, it would contain carefully prepared decoy files. Every document would look authentic at first glance, while embedding invisible tracking markers capable of identifying exactly when, where, and how any stolen data was accessed. The genuine business records would remain somewhere entirely different. I stared at the screen for several seconds before asking the obvious question. "Do you really think Brandon would try to steal company data?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the laptop and looked out the office window toward the manor. "People under financial pressure stop believing they have choices," he said quietly. "Once someone convinces themselves they're entitled to something, breaking into an office becomes much easier than earning what's inside it." Michael slowly nodded. "And every option available to Brandon is disappearing." Daniel looked at all three of us before making the decision. "Build the decoy." Ethan smiled. "Already started." For the next several days, everything at Willowmere appeared completely normal. Weddings continued. Corporate retreats arrived and departed. New reservations filled the calendar almost faster than we could process them. Outwardly, it looked as though Brandon's campaign had finally stalled. In reality, we had simply stopped reacting to every move he made. We had begun preparing for the move we believed would eventually come. Looking back now, I realize we weren't building a trap because we wanted revenge. We were building it because Brandon had already shown us something important. Every time one plan failed, he crossed another line. First came legal threats, then fake investors, then false government complaints, then sabotage. There was only one direction left for someone who believed the business itself contained the answer to all his problems. He would eventually try to take what he couldn't win in court. As I locked my office that evening, I found myself wondering whether Brandon was already making that decision somewhere across town. I didn't know when he would come. I didn't know how he would do it. But for the first time since this battle began, I was certain of one thing. If Brandon walked into Willowmere believing he was about to steal my future, he was actually walking straight into the biggest mistake of his life. 2 weeks passed without a single incident, and that worried me far more than if Brandon had continued making threats every day. People who spend their entire lives believing they deserve success don't suddenly accept failure in silence. They wait, they convince themselves they're smarter than everyone else, and then they gamble everything on one final move. Daniel felt the same way. Every few days, he would call simply to ask whether anything unusual had happened around Willowmere. My answer was always the same. Nothing. Michael kept monitoring Brandon's financial situation, and every report painted an even darker picture. Another lender had filed legal action. One of his business partners had withdrawn from a development project after discovering several financial irregularities. Even the developers Brandon had promised Willowmere to were beginning to question whether he actually controlled the property. His entire plan was collapsing faster than anyone expected. The only thing we didn't know was how he intended to stop it. Then, on a cold Tuesday morning just before sunrise, my phone vibrated on the nightstand beside my bed. It wasn't a call. It was an automated security alert generated by Ethan's new monitoring system. Unauthorized access attempt detected. Administrative server room. I was fully awake before I finished reading the notification. Less than 10 seconds later, Ethan called. "Don't come here yet," he said immediately. His voice was calm, but I could hear controlled urgency underneath it. "Someone's inside the administration building." "How do you know?" The biometric lock rejected an access attempt 3 times. 30 seconds later, another interior sensor activated. Whoever it is found another way in. My heart started pounding. "I'm leaving now." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Meet Daniel first. I've already called him. Let security and the sheriff handle the building until we know what's happening." 10 minutes later, I met Daniel in the parking lot of a nearby coffee shop less than 5 minutes from Willowmere. We drove back together while Ethan monitored the surveillance system remotely. During the drive, he kept updating us through the speakerphone. "The intruder avoided the main hallway cameras," he explained. "Whoever it is studied the building layout beforehand." Daniel glanced at me. Neither of us needed to say Brandon's name. "They've reached the server room," Ethan continued. "They're trying to access the primary workstation." We arrived just as 2 sheriff's deputies were pulling through the front gates. Willowmere looked completely peaceful from the outside. The sunrise reflected off the windows exactly as it had every other morning, yet I knew someone was inside trying to steal everything I had spent years building. Security officers met us near the administration wing and confirmed that a rear maintenance door had been forced open using professional burglary tools. Whoever entered knew exactly where they were going. They hadn't searched offices or storage rooms. They had walked directly toward the server room. Ethan joined us a few minutes later carrying his laptop. Instead of rushing inside, he opened the computer on the hood of Daniel's car. "Watch this," he said quietly. He logged into the security network and replayed footage from inside the administration corridor. A man wearing dark clothing, gloves, and a baseball cap appeared on the screen just after 4:30 that morning. His face remained hidden almost the entire time, but his movements were calm and deliberate. He wasn't looking for valuables. He ignored expensive equipment sitting in nearby offices. He headed straight for the server room exactly as Ethan predicted. Once inside, he removed several portable storage devices from his backpack and connected them to what appeared to be our primary server. 15 minutes later, he disconnected everything, lifted the server itself into a protective carrying case, and quietly left the building before deputies arrived. I looked at Ethan. He took it. Ethan smiled for the first time all morning. "No." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned the laptop toward me and displayed another camera angle from inside a secured room on the opposite side of the building. Hidden behind reinforced doors sat the real production servers, quietly operating without interruption. "He stole the decoy." Daniel couldn't help smiling. So every file he copied, Ethan nodded, is exactly what we wanted him to take. My heartbeat finally slowed. Weeks earlier, the idea of building a fake server had almost sounded excessive. Standing there that morning, I realized it had been one of the smartest decisions we had made. Every document inside the stolen machine looked authentic: financial statements, ownership records, development plans, client databases, vendor agreements, banking information. Everything appeared genuine, but every file contained invisible forensic markers capable of identifying the device used to open it, the location where it was accessed, and the exact time each document was copied or forwarded. Whoever believed they had stolen my company had actually carried away a digital beacon that would quietly document every move they made. One of the deputies approached us after finishing the initial inspection. "Whoever broke in knew what they wanted," he said. "Nothing else was touched." Daniel looked at me before answering. "That's exactly what concerns us." The deputy nodded, took additional photographs, and assured us that detectives would continue processing the scene. As everyone returned to work, Ethan remained focused on his laptop. About 30 minutes later, a small notification appeared in the corner of his screen. He leaned closer before looking up at us. "It's happening." "What is?" I asked. He pointed at the monitor. One of the decoy files had just been opened from a computer located several miles away from Willowmere. Seconds later, another file opened, then another. Each one quietly transmitted location data back through Ethan's tracking system exactly as designed. Whoever possessed the stolen server had wasted no time exploring what they believed were the secrets to my business. I stared at the screen as the activity log continued growing line by line. Brandon thought he had finally stolen the evidence he needed to take Willowmere. He had no idea that every click, every copied file, and every decision he made from that moment forward was leaving a trail that led directly back to him. Looking back now, that break-in wasn't the moment Brandon came closest to winning. It was the moment he unknowingly began building the strongest case against himself. And the biggest mistake he made wasn't stealing my server, it was believing he had stolen the right one. The first notification from Ethan's tracking system appeared less than 30 minutes after the stolen server left Willowmere. By the end of that afternoon, we had recorded dozens of access attempts from the same location. Every document the intruder opened silently reported back to Ethan's monitoring software exactly as he had designed it to do. I sat in his office watching lines of data appear across his screen while he calmly explained what each entry meant. "They're opening ownership records first," he said. "Now they're checking vendor contracts. Here come the financial statements." He looked at me and smiled faintly. "Whoever has that server believes they're holding your entire business in their hands." Daniel leaned over Ethan's shoulder. "Can they tell the files are fake?" Ethan shook his head. "Not unless they compare them with the originals, and they don't have the originals." I watched another notification appear, then another. Every click felt less like someone stealing from me, and more like someone voluntarily signing their own confession. The system wasn't recording passwords or private communications. It wasn't hacking into anyone else's computers. It was simply documenting activity involving files that belonged to my company and had been taken during a burglary. Every access generated a timestamp, a device signature, and a network location. Daniel quietly reminded all of us to stay disciplined. "We already have enough evidence to report the break-in," he said. "From this point forward, we do everything by the book." I appreciated hearing that because, despite everything Brandon had done, I never wanted this fight to become about revenge. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. Over the next 3 days, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The stolen files were opened repeatedly from the same office building on the outskirts of the city. Michael recognized the address almost immediately. It belonged to one of the development firms Brandon had been trying to impress for weeks, the same company he had promised control of Willowmere. I remember staring at the address on Ethan's screen, thinking about how confident Brandon must have felt walking into that meeting. In his mind, he wasn't showing stolen information. He was presenting proof that he already controlled a luxury estate worth millions of dollars. In reality, every presentation, Every copied document and every forwarded file was strengthening the timeline Daniel had been building since my mother first walked through my gates with that legal folder. Michael spent the next several days verifying everything independently. He interviewed public sources, reviewed business filings, and confirmed that Brandon had scheduled multiple meetings with the developers immediately after the burglary. None of that proved he personally entered Willowmere, but together the pieces were beginning to fit with remarkable precision. Then, another unexpected development changed everything. One of the senior partners at the development firm contacted Daniel directly. At first, we assumed it was another legal threat. Instead, the man requested a confidential meeting. Daniel insisted we meet at his law office rather than Willowmere, and 2 days later the four of us sat across a conference table from a businessman who looked considerably more uncomfortable than I expected. He placed a leather folder in front of Daniel before speaking. Mr. Carter approached us with an investment opportunity, he began carefully. He claimed he had secured operational control of Willowmere Estate and provided documents to support that claim. Daniel remained silent. The man continued. Our legal department reviewed the material and discovered inconsistencies. He paused before sliding several printed pages across the table. Yesterday we learned the county investigation into the break-in had become public information. Once we connected the timing, we became concerned these documents might not have been obtained legally. I looked down at the pages. They were printouts from Ethan's decoy server, exactly as designed. The executive sighed heavily. Our company has no interest in participating in anything involving stolen property or fraudulent representations. We thought your attorney should know what happened. After he left, none of us spoke for several seconds. Daniel finally closed the folder and looked at me. Brandon just made a catastrophic mistake. Michael nodded. He didn't just possess stolen business information. He used it to persuade potential investors, Ethan quietly added. And every file they reviewed generated another tracking record. I couldn't help thinking back to the day Brandon stood in my courtyard holding that crowbar, convinced everything could be taken simply because he wanted it badly enough. He had spent his entire life believing confidence could replace preparation. That belief was finally collapsing under the weight of evidence he had unknowingly created himself. Later that evening, I walked alone through the gardens after the last guests had returned to their rooms. The estate looked exactly as it always had, peaceful, welcoming, alive. Yet I knew something had fundamentally changed. For weeks I had been reacting to Brandon's attacks. Now the facts were beginning to move on their own. Every lie he told required another document. Every document led investigators to another question. Every question brought them one step closer to the truth. Standing beneath the old oak tree my father loved so much, I realized I no longer felt afraid of what Brandon might do next. I was far more interested in what would happen when he finally understood that the trap he believed he had escaped had actually been closing around him from the moment he walked out of Willowmere carrying that stolen server. By the time the development firm's attorneys voluntarily contacted Daniel, Brandon had unknowingly reached the point where every move he made created more evidence against himself than against me. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if he ever paused long enough to ask himself a simple question. What if I was wrong? But people who spend their lives believing the rules don't apply to them rarely stop to question their own assumptions. They simply double down. A few days after our meeting with the developers, Ethan called me just before lunch. You should come to the security office, he said. I think we're about to learn something important. When I arrived, Daniel and Michael were already there. Ethan had several monitors displaying activity logs from the decoy files. One particular document had suddenly become very active. It was a fabricated financial projection describing an imaginary redevelopment plan for Willowmere. The numbers looked convincing, but every figure had been intentionally created to identify unauthorized distribution. Ethan enlarged the activity report. Someone forwarded this file to 6 different email addresses within the last hour. Michael studied the list carefully. Investment firms, he said. Commercial lenders. 2 private equity groups. Daniel quietly shook his head. He's still trying to raise money using property he doesn't own. Ethan clicked another window. And here's the interesting part. He pointed toward a timestamp. The original file wasn't copied from the server anymore. It was copied from another laptop. I frowned. Meaning? Meaning Brandon isn't working alone. Silence filled the room. That possibility had always existed, but until that moment we had never been able to support it with evidence. Someone else now possessed copies of the stolen documents and was actively helping circulate them. Michael immediately began tracing the organizations receiving the files while Daniel contacted the detective assigned to the burglary investigation. Everything remained within legal procedure. We weren't asking anyone to make arrests. We were simply providing new evidence connected to an active criminal investigation. Later that afternoon, the detective called Daniel back with unexpected news. Officers had already interviewed one employee from the development company after learning that confidential business documents had been presented during investment meetings. According to the employee's statement, Brandon repeatedly insisted he had full operational control of Willowmere and claimed legal paperwork would be finalized within days. Hearing those words made me shake my head. Even after every setback, he still believed confidence could replace truth. Michael spent the next 48 hours following another trail. When we met again, he placed several photographs on my desk. They showed Brandon entering and leaving the same office building multiple times over the previous week. Different clothes, different days. The same black laptop case appeared in every photograph. Ethan immediately recognized it. That's almost certainly where the stolen server is. Daniel looked at all of us before speaking. Then we stopped guessing. He contacted the detective again and forwarded the additional evidence. This time, the response came much faster. Because the investigation now involved a commercial burglary, stolen digital property, and possible fraud involving interstate investors, additional agencies requested access to the growing case file. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. There were no surprise arrests or television cameras outside anyone's office. Real investigations rarely work that way. Instead, experienced investigators quietly collected documents, compared timelines, interviewed witnesses, and allowed the evidence to speak for itself. Watching that process unfold reminded me why I had chosen patience from the very beginning. Every time Brandon rushed forward, he left another footprint. Every time I slowed down, another piece of the puzzle appeared. One evening, as I finished reviewing contracts in my office, I received another text message from Brandon. "You should have accepted my offer while you had the chance." I stared at the message for several seconds before locking my phone without replying. Weeks earlier, words like that would have kept me awake all night. Now they sounded different. They no longer came from a man in control. They came from someone desperately trying to convince himself that control hadn't already slipped away. Daniel called me the following morning after speaking with investigators. "There's one thing I want you to remember," he said. "Don't celebrate too early. I'm not good. Cases are won with evidence, not emotion." I smiled because that sentence sounded exactly like something my father would have said. Throughout this entire battle, I had learned something he probably understood long before I did. Winning isn't about delivering the hardest punch. It's about refusing to throw one before the right moment arrives. As another weekend approached, Willowmere welcomed hundreds of new guests for conferences, anniversaries, and family celebrations. Children laughed across the gardens. Couples walked beside the lake at sunset. Employees who had become like family greeted visitors by name. Watching life continue normally inside the place I had built reminded me what was truly worth protecting. Brandon had spent months chasing buildings, contracts, and money because he believed that was where value lived. He never understood that Willowmere's greatest strength wasn't the estate itself. It was the trust people placed in it every single day. And trust, unlike stolen documents or inherited property, can never be taken by force. It has to be earned. Looking back now, I realize that was the lesson my brother never learned, and it was the reason everything he touched eventually fell apart. Little did I know, the investigators were only days away from uncovering the final piece of evidence that would transform our private family battle into a criminal case Brandon would never be able to talk his way out of. The following Tuesday began like every other morning at Willowmere. Guests checked out after breakfast. New conference attendees arrived before noon. Gardeners trimmed hedges along the western terrace. And Lucas Bennett was already arguing with one of his suppliers over the quality of fresh seafood. If you had walked through the estate that day, you never would have guessed that one of the biggest investigations of my life was quietly moving toward its conclusion. That was something I learned through this experience. Real life doesn't pause while justice catches up. Bills still need to be paid. Employees still expect leadership. Guests still deserve your full attention, even when your own world feels uncertain. Around 11 o'clock, Daniel called and asked me to meet him at his office instead of discussing anything over the phone. His voice sounded calm, but I knew him well enough to recognize when he was deliberately choosing his words. That usually meant something significant had happened. When I arrived, Michael and Ethan were already sitting around the conference table. Several folders were spread neatly across the surface, but none of them spoke immediately. Daniel waited until I sat down before sliding a single document toward me. It wasn't another financial report. It was a search warrant application prepared by investigators. I looked at the first page, then the second, before finally looking back at Daniel. "They have enough?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "Enough to ask a judge for permission to recover the stolen equipment and search for ladonal evidence." My heart began beating faster than it had in weeks. This wasn't speculation anymore. Everything Brandon had done since stealing the decoy server had slowly brought investigators to this exact point. Michael pointed toward one section of the affidavit. The tracking data from Ethan's files established a timeline. The burglary report established the theft. The development firm's statements established that the stolen information was being presented as legitimate business material. Together, those facts created probable cause. I slowly read through several more pages. Every event appeared exactly as it had happened. Dates, times, surveillance footage, digital access logs, witness statements. None of it relied on assumptions. It relied on evidence. Daniel smiled slightly when he saw me reading so carefully. "This is why I've been telling you not to chase Brandon." Every time we stayed patient, he supplied another piece himself. Later that afternoon, the warrant was approved. Investigators executed it quietly, without television cameras or dramatic headlines. They searched the office Brandon had been using with the development group and recovered the server he believed contained my company's future. Ethan was invited to assist in identifying the equipment because he had originally configured the system. That evening, he called me from the forensic laboratory. I could hear controlled excitement in his voice. "It's definitely the decoy server." "Was anything still on it?" I asked. He laughed softly. "Everything." The thieves had never realized they were working with a decoy. They hadn't deleted files. They hadn't wiped activity logs. They hadn't even disconnected several external storage devices still containing copied documents. According to Ethan, investigators recovered multiple USB drives, printed financial projections, presentation materials, and handwritten notes outlining Brandon's proposed redevelopment of Willowmere. Several pages even included estimated profits based on selling property he had never legally controlled. I leaned back in my chair, almost unable to believe what I was hearing. Brandon hadn't simply stolen information. He had built an entire business strategy around it. The following morning, Michael brought another update. One of the individuals who had attended Brandon's investment presentations had agreed to cooperate fully with investigators after learning the documents originated from a commercial burglary. The witness voluntarily surrendered email chains, presentation schedules, and meeting notes covering nearly 3 weeks of discussions. Every new statement strengthened the timeline even further. Daniel remained cautious despite the growing evidence. "Remember," he reminded me, "evidence wins cases. Emotion loses them. Let the investigators do their work." I appreciated that advice because, despite everything Brandon had put me through, I felt remarkably calm. Somewhere along the way, my desire to defeat him had disappeared. What remained was something much simpler. I wanted the truth to reach the people responsible for judging it. I no longer needed revenge, because Brandon had spent months creating consequences with his own decisions. Late that evening, As I walked alone across the terrace overlooking the lake, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Brandon appeared on the screen. "You still have time to negotiate before this gets ugly." I stared at those words for a long moment before quietly deleting them. He still didn't know. He still believed he was controlling the situation. He had no idea investigators had already recovered the stolen server. He had no idea the development firm had begun cooperating. He had no idea witnesses were voluntarily providing records of his meetings. Most importantly, he had no idea that every document he believed strengthened his position had actually become evidence against him. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued walking beneath the old oak trees my father loved so much. For months, Brandon had treated Willowmere as if it were nothing more than a valuable piece of land waiting to be sold. He never understood that the greatest investment I made wasn't restoring buildings. It was surrounding myself with honest people who believed in doing things the right way. Daniel protected the law. Michael followed the money. Ethan protected the truth hidden inside data. Each of them had quietly done their job while Brandon searched for shortcuts. Standing there beneath the evening sky, I finally realized the fight was no longer about whether I could save Willowmere. That battle had already been won. The only question left was how Brandon would react when he discovered that the evidence he thought would make him rich was about to cost him everything he had left. By the end of that week, I realized something almost surreal. For months, I had been waking up every morning wondering what Brandon would do next. Now I was waking up wondering how he would react when he finally learned that the ground beneath him had already disappeared. Investigators had recovered the stolen server. The development firm's executives were cooperating. Witnesses had voluntarily turned over emails, meeting notes, and presentation materials. Ethan had verified that every important file Brandon believed he possessed had originated from the decoy server we intentionally placed in his path. None of those facts had become public yet, and that silence created an unusual calm. Brandon still believed he was one move away from winning. I knew he was running out of moves entirely. Early Monday morning, Daniel called me before I reached my office. "The investigators want one final meeting," he said. "Nothing dramatic. They just want to close a few gaps before making their next decision." I drove straight to his office, where Michael and Ethan were already waiting. This meeting felt different from all the others. For months, we had been collecting pieces of a puzzle. Now those pieces were finally being assembled into a complete picture. An investigator entered the conference room carrying a thick case file. He thanked each of us for our cooperation and explained that they were conducting one final chronological review before presenting everything to the prosecutor's office. I listened quietly as he summarized the timeline. My mother's visit to Willowmere with the trust documents, Brandon's false ownership claims, the fake investors, the fraudulent dispute filed against the property, the anonymous complaints that triggered unnecessary inspections, the attempted sabotage before the wedding, the burglary, the stolen server, the investment presentations based on stolen company records. Every event connected naturally to the next. There were no missing pieces anymore. Hearing the entire story told in order made me realize just how carefully Brandon had destroyed himself. Nobody had forced him to take any of those steps. Each decision had simply made the following decision easier until turning back no longer seemed possible. When the investigator finished, he looked toward Ethan. "Can you explain the tracking system one more time?" Ethan nodded and connected his laptop to the conference room monitor. Unlike the first time I saw it, I now understood exactly what I was looking at. Every colored line represented a document from the decoy server. Every timestamp showed when it had been opened. Every location identified where the file had been accessed. Ethan enlarged one section of the screen displaying dozens of entries over several weeks. "This wasn't surveillance of private computers," he explained. "These were forensic markers embedded inside our own corporate documents before the burglary occurred. Once those files were stolen and opened, they authenticated themselves through our licensing system." The investigator nodded, meaning the activity originated only after the documents left Willowmere illegally. "Correct." Daniel added one final clarification. "Every step complied with applicable law." We protected our own property. We didn't intrude into anyone else's systems. The investigator smiled slightly. That's exactly why this evidence is so valuable. Michael then presented the financial timeline he had spent weeks assembling. Brandon's refinancing, default notices, private loans, missed payments, failed developments, collection actions. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. Brandon hadn't stolen company information because he wanted to expand a business. He stole it because he believed it was the only remaining way to escape financial collapse. Motive, opportunity, actions, consequences. The entire case suddenly felt painfully simple. After the meeting ended, Daniel walked me toward the parking garage. We stood beside my car for a moment, without speaking. Finally, he broke the silence. "How are you holding up?" I thought about the question longer than I expected. Months earlier, I probably would have answered with anger. Instead, I surprised even myself. "I'm sad," I admitted. Daniel looked at me without interrupting. "Not because of what's happening," I continued. "Because none of this had to happen." I looked across the street at people walking to lunch, completely unaware that my family had spent months destroying itself over something that could never truly be stolen. If Brandon had simply accepted what Dad gave him, if he'd built something of his own instead of chasing mine, we'd probably still be a family. Daniel nodded slowly. Greed usually convinces people they're losing something that never belonged to them in the first place. That sentence stayed with me all the way back to Willowmere. Later that evening, I walked through the estate after most guests had gone inside. The gardens were quiet. Lights reflected across the lake. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear soft piano music drifting from the ballroom where a small anniversary celebration was finishing. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about legal documents or investigations. I was thinking about my father. I finally understood why he had given Brandon wealth and given me Willowmere. At the time, I believed he had divided his estate. In reality, he had revealed our character. Brandon inherited finished success and slowly destroyed it because he never learned how to create value. I inherited a forgotten property that everyone else considered worthless, and by rebuilding it, I unknowingly rebuilt myself. The estate had never been my greatest inheritance. The opportunity to become the person capable of saving it was. As I stood beneath the stars that night, my phone remained completely silent. No threats, no demands, no messages from Brandon. It was the first truly quiet evening since this entire battle began. Looking back now, I realize that silence wasn't the end of the story. It was the silence that comes just before the truth finally steps into the light, and before Brandon would have to face consequences that no amount of money, manipulation, or false confidence could ever buy his way out of. A little more than a week after the investigators completed their final review, I received an invitation that changed everything. It came from the Hudson Valley Business Alliance, an organization that hosted one of the largest annual charity galas in our region. Willowmere had been selected to host the event nearly a year earlier, long before my family declared war on me. More than 400 guests were expected to attend, including business owners, investors, nonprofit directors, bankers, local officials, and many of the same executives who had trusted Willowmere with their companies over the past 3 years. Under normal circumstances, it would have been one of the proudest nights of my career. Instead, I immediately wondered whether Brandon would see it as one last opportunity to destroy everything in public. I wasn't being paranoid anymore. By then, I understood his pattern. Every time another door closed, he searched for a larger audience. Daniel agreed. When I showed him the event schedule, he studied it for a moment before saying, "If he still believes he can control the narrative, this is exactly where he'll try." Michael nodded. "He's running out of lenders, out of investors, and out of time. Public pressure is the only weapon he has left." Ethan quietly added, "Our systems are secure. Whatever happens tonight, it won't be because he surprises us." Even so, we prepared carefully. Not because we planned to embarrass Brandon, but because I had learned that preparation was the only reason I was still standing. Every contract connected to the gala was reviewed again. Every security camera was tested. every guest list was confirmed. Every digital presentation scheduled for the ballroom was backed up in 3 separate locations. If Brandon wanted confusion, he wasn't going to find it at Willowmere. The afternoon of the gala arrived with perfect weather. As I walked through the estate checking final details, I couldn't help remembering the abandoned property I had first inherited 3 years earlier. The cracked stone paths had become elegant walkways lined with lanterns. The collapsing gardens were now filled with flowers in full bloom. The ballroom that once leaked every time it rained now glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, while staff placed the final centerpieces across dozens of tables. Watching my employees move confidently through the building filled me with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with money. Together, we had created something that people genuinely loved. That was something Brandon had never understood. You can't steal the years people invest in believing in you. Guests began arriving shortly before 6 o'clock. Business leaders greeted one another. Local reporters photographed the charity displays. Music drifted through the courtyard while servers carried trays of champagne across the terrace. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Then I saw a familiar black SUV pull through the front gates. Brandon stepped out wearing an expensive tailored suit that looked newer than anything I'd ever seen him wear. My mother climbed out a few seconds later, dressed as though she were attending an awards ceremony instead of a charity fundraiser. They hadn't been invited by me. They had been invited months earlier through the business alliance before any of this began. For a brief moment, Brandon simply stood in the courtyard looking around the estate. His expression wasn't admiration, it was frustration. Willowmere was busier than ever. Every parking space was full. Guests filled the gardens. The success he had spent months trying to destroy was unfolding right in front of him. When he noticed me speaking with several donors near the entrance, he smiled and walked directly toward us. I recognized that smile immediately. It was the same one he wore whenever he believed people were watching. "Natalie," he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Congratulations on tonight's event." His voice sounded warm, almost friendly, but I knew my brother too well to mistake performance for sincerity. "Thank you," I replied calmly. "I'm glad you could make it." He glanced around the courtyard before speaking even louder. "I suppose everyone deserves to enjoy Willowmere while they still can." Several conversations nearby grew noticeably quieter. There it was. The performance had begun. One of the investors standing beside me looked confused. "What do you mean by that?" Brandon smiled confidently, exactly as I expected. "Let's just say ownership changes are coming sooner than most people realize." My mother stepped forward before anyone else could respond. "Some legal matters are finally being resolved," she added. "Families have a way of correcting unfortunate mistakes." I could almost feel dozens of people listening without pretending not to. Rumors spread quickly in business circles, and Brandon knew it. He wanted uncertainty. He wanted guests leaving the gala questioning whether Willowmere had a future. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "That's an interesting statement." He folded his arms. "It's the truth." "Then I'm sure you won't mind explaining it clearly." For the first time that evening, the smile on his face hesitated. He had expected me to avoid the conversation, not invite it. One of the business alliance directors approached us, sensing the growing tension. "Is everything all right?" Brandon answered before I could speak. "Perfectly. We're simply discussing the future ownership of the estate." More people stopped walking. More heads turned toward us. The courtyard grew unusually quiet. Brandon believed he had finally found the audience he wanted. What he didn't realize was that the audience was no longer hearing only his version of the story. Daniel quietly stepped out of the ballroom and joined me without saying a word. A few moments later, Michael appeared near the entrance, followed by Ethan carrying a slim laptop case. None of them interrupted. None of them raised their voices. They simply stood beside me. Looking back now, I remember realizing something that changed the way I viewed courage forever. Real confidence doesn't arrive with shouting, threats, or dramatic speeches. It arrives quietly, built on preparation, patience, and the simple knowledge that the truth no longer needs your help to survive. Brandon thought he had come to expose me in front of 400 influential people. He had no idea that before the night was over, the very audience he wanted to impress would witness the beginning of the collapse he had spent months creating with his own hands. The silence that settled over the courtyard felt heavier than any speech Brandon could have given. More than 400 guests stood only a few feet away, pretending not to watch while listening to every word. Investors, attorneys, bankers, business owners, charity organizers, local officials, and many of my longtime clients had all become unwilling witnesses to what my brother believed would be his greatest victory. Brandon looked completely comfortable. He mistook attention for control, just as he always had. He smiled confidently and spread his hands as though he were announcing exciting news instead of trying to destroy his own sister's reputation. "Since everyone seems interested," he said loudly, "I'll save Natalie the trouble. Willowmere is currently under legal dispute, and once the remaining paperwork is finalized, management of this property will be transferred. Some of the people standing here tonight may want to reconsider signing future agreements until ownership becomes clear." I heard quiet whispers move through the crowd. Brandon had achieved exactly what he wanted. He had planted doubt. My mother stood beside him with her chin slightly raised, convinced the room was finally seeing me the way she always had. For just a moment, I looked around the courtyard. I saw employees who had trusted me for years, couples who had celebrated weddings here, corporate clients who returned every season, friends who believed in Willowmere long before it became successful. I realized I wasn't standing there to defend myself anymore. I was standing there to protect every person who had helped build this place with me. I looked at Brandon and spoke as calmly as I had the day he first walked through my gates carrying a crowbar. "Are you finished?" He laughed. "You don't really have much to say now, do you?" "Actually," I replied, "I have something I'd like everyone here to hear." I turned toward Daniel. Without saying a word, he handed me a thin folder. Inside were only a few documents, not because we lacked evidence, but because we no longer needed to overwhelm anyone with paper. Facts were enough. "3 months ago," I began, "my brother claimed he had the legal authority to take Willowmere. Since then, he has filed ownership disputes, sent people here pretending to be investors, triggered false government complaints, attempted to interfere with my business, and publicly represented himself as the future owner of this estate." Brandon immediately interrupted. "Because it's true. I didn't even look at him. Would you like to explain why the development firm you approached voluntarily contacted my attorney?" His smile disappeared for the first time that evening. Several guests exchanged confused looks. I continued before he could answer. "Would you also like to explain why documents belonging to my company appeared during your investment presentations before you had any legal right to possess them?" Brandon's face tightened. "You're lying." Daniel calmly stepped forward. "Actually, the executives from that development firm provided sworn statements confirming exactly what Miss Carter just described." The courtyard became noticeably quieter. My mother looked at Brandon, clearly expecting him to answer immediately. He didn't. Ethan quietly opened his laptop and connected it to the ballroom display system that had been prepared for the charity presentation earlier that evening. Moments later, one of the large screens inside the ballroom displayed a simple timeline. No dramatic graphics, no accusations, just dates: my mother's visit, the ownership filing, anonymous complaints, the attempted sabotage, the burglary, the recovery of the stolen server. Each event appeared in chronological order. Then Ethan displayed another screen showing access records generated by the decoy files after they had been stolen. "These records," he explained calmly, "were created automatically when proprietary company documents were opened after the burglary. They identify when the files were accessed and where they were presented." Brandon took one step forward. "Turn that off." Ethan didn't move. "Every record has already been provided to investigators." A murmur spread through the audience. One of the investors I recognized from previous conferences slowly folded his arms and looked directly at Brandon. "Is this true?" Brandon looked around the courtyard as though searching for someone to rescue him. My mother finally spoke. "They're twisting everything." Before anyone else could respond, another familiar voice came from behind the crowd. "No, Mrs. Carter." Everyone turned. Two detectives walked into the courtyard accompanied by several additional investigators dressed in plain clothes. Their arrival wasn't loud or dramatic. They simply walked with the quiet confidence of people who already knew why they were there. The lead detective approached Daniel first, exchanged a few words, then turned toward Brandon. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, "we've been trying to reach you." Brandon forced an awkward smile. "This isn't the time." "Actually," the detective replied, "it's overdue." My brother's confidence evaporated so quickly that it almost looked painful. He glanced toward my mother, then toward the main gate, then back at the detective. "This is a misunderstanding." The detective remained calm. "You've already had multiple opportunities to explain the evidence." Brandon shook his head. "I didn't steal anything." The detective looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Then perhaps you'll be able to explain why company records recovered during the execution of a search warrant matched files taken during the burglary at Willowmere." No one in the crowd spoke. Even the music inside the ballroom had stopped. I watched Brandon trying desperately to think of another story, another excuse, another shortcut. For the first time in his life, none of them appeared. My mother reached for his arm. "Say something." He couldn't. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Finally, the detective informed Brandon that he needed to accompany them for further questioning regarding the ongoing investigation involving commercial burglary, possession of stolen business property, and related fraud allegations. They didn't shout. They didn't force him to the ground. They simply followed the law, exactly as Daniel had insisted from the beginning. Brandon looked at me one last time before leaving. I expected anger. I expected hatred. Instead, I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of a world where confidence could no longer erase consequences. As the investigators escorted him toward the front gate, I looked around the courtyard once more. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. They simply stood in silence, watching the truth finish what lies had started months earlier. And as I stood there beneath the lights of Willowmere, I realized that justice rarely arrives with dramatic speeches. More often, it arrives quietly, after patience has finally given the truth enough time to catch up. 6 months passed before I truly understood that winning and healing are not the same thing. The investigation continued exactly the way Daniel had predicted it would. Quietly, methodically, without dramatic headlines or daily surprises. Investigators interviewed witnesses, analyzed financial records, compared digital evidence, and followed every legal procedure that Brandon had spent months trying to avoid. I wasn't called into court every week, nor did I spend my days celebrating what had happened. In fact, most mornings looked exactly like they always had. I walked through the gardens before sunrise, greeted employees as they arrived, met with clients, approved event schedules, tasted new menu ideas with Lucas Bennett, reviewed budgets, and watched Willowmere continue growing one guest at a time. Life has an interesting way of reminding you that even the biggest battles eventually become yesterday's news. Business doesn't stop because your heart is still catching up. One afternoon, Daniel called and asked if I had time to meet for coffee instead of coming to his office. That alone told me the conversation was different. We sat outside a small cafe overlooking the river, and for several minutes neither of us talked about legal matters. Finally, he placed a single folder on the table. "It's finished," he said. I opened it slowly. The criminal investigation had officially concluded. The evidence recovered from the burglary, the fraudulent investment presentations, the financial records, the witness statements, and the digital forensic reports had all been accepted as part of the case. Separate civil proceedings involving Brandon's failed businesses had also reached their conclusion. Creditors had obtained judgments against several of his companies, and because he could no longer satisfy those obligations, liquidation proceedings had begun. I read every page carefully before closing the folder again. I expected relief. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sadness. Daniel seemed to understand without me saying a word. "You still wish it hadn't ended this way," he said. I nodded. "He's my brother." Daniel looked toward the river for a moment before speaking. "People often think justice means watching someone lose everything." Sometimes justice is simply allowing someone to face the consequences they spent years avoiding. Those words stayed with me long after we finished our coffee. A few weeks later, I learned that my mother's house had been sold during the financial settlements. The mortgage she secretly signed to rescue Brandon had become impossible to repay after his businesses collapsed. She moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Several relatives quietly distanced themselves from her, not because they hated her, but because they had finally learned how much she had hidden while defending Brandon's decisions. I thought I would feel satisfied hearing that news. I didn't. I felt tired. Carrying resentment for so long had been exhausting, and I suddenly realized I didn't want to carry it anymore. Not because anyone deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. About a month later, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. There was no return address, but I immediately recognized my mother's handwriting. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for Willowmere. She didn't ask me to change my testimony or speak to anyone on Brandon's behalf. Instead, she wrote something I had waited my entire life to hear. She admitted that she had spent years confusing love with favoritism. She admitted that every time she excused Brandon's behavior, she believed she was protecting him, when in reality she had only delayed the consequences that eventually became impossible to escape. She apologized for treating my accomplishments as though they mattered less simply because I wasn't her son. I read the letter 3 times, then I folded it carefully and placed it inside my desk drawer. People sometimes ask whether I forgave her. The honest answer is complicated. I forgave her because I didn't want anger deciding the rest of my life. But forgiveness didn't erase the past, and it didn't rebuild trust overnight. Some relationships survive apologies. Others simply become lessons you carry forward. Brandon and I never rebuilt our relationship. By the time everything ended, we had become strangers connected only by memories of a family that no longer existed. I don't know whether he ever accepted responsibility for everything that happened. Maybe one day he will. Maybe he won't. That's no longer my burden to carry. My responsibility was never to save Brandon from the consequences of his choices. My responsibility was to protect the people who believed in me, the employees who trusted Willowmere with their careers, the couples who celebrated weddings beneath those old oak trees, the families who created memories inside those restored walls, and the dream my father quietly placed in my hands the day everyone else thought he had given me the worthless inheritance. Sometimes visitors ask me why I never sold Willowmere after everything that happened. The answer is always the same. Because this place stopped being an inheritance a long time ago. It became proof that what you build through patience, integrity, and relentless effort can survive even the people who try hardest to destroy it. Every morning when I unlock the front doors, I still pause for a moment and look across the gardens, just as I did on the day my mother first walked through those gates demanding that I surrender everything. The difference is that fear no longer greets me there. Gratitude does. Gratitude for the employees who stood beside me. Gratitude for Daniel Brooks, who taught me that preparation is stronger than panic. Gratitude for Michael Grant, who followed the truth hidden inside numbers. Gratitude for Ethan Cole, who understood that protecting information can sometimes protect an entire future. Most of all, gratitude for my father, Richard Carter. For years I believed he had left Brandon the better inheritance and given me the harder path. Looking back now, I finally understand what he actually gave us. He gave Brandon everything that could be spent. He gave me something that had to be earned. One inheritance disappeared because it depended on money. The other grew because it depended on character. If there's one lesson my story has taught me, it's this. Never measure your future by what someone else receives. Measure it by what you're willing to build when nobody believes in you. Because wealth can be inherited, power can be borrowed, and lies can survive for a while, but character is the only investment that continues paying dividends long after everything else has been taken away. And every evening, as the lights come on across Willowmere, and another family celebrates another unforgettable moment beneath the same sky that once witnessed the darkest chapter of my life, I quietly smile to myself because I finally know something my brother never did. The greatest victory was never keeping the estate. The greatest victory was becoming the woman capable of saving it.